Howdy folks, Spencer here. Today, Cryptic has done something that many of us were not really expecting, and that is that they are communicating about the recent nerf to the Maelstrom Torpedo launcher. They have a really nice blog that I'll be breaking down in today's video, and in that blog, they're detailing the issues that they saw with the Maelstrom that caused them to go through and nerf it in the first place. They're going through and then recognizing the feedback that myself and many of you have sent to them since the nerf, and they're discussing how they're going to be addressing it moving forward and the strategy that they want to use to address other powers in the game that have issues moving forward as well. So it's a really good blog, and I'm going to start off by reading the entire thing out. Then I'll talk about what this means for the Maelstrom Torpedo and some of the other things that we can take away from this blog. So those chapters will be listed down below if you want to skip ahead, but let's dive right in to the full readout of the blog. Greetings, Captains. We'd like to share our thinking about where the Maelstrom is at, the follow-up changes it's getting, and how we're making these decisions. For context, the Maelstrom Quantum Torpedo is an experimental new type of weapon introduced on the legendary Akira earlier this year. Our hope was that it would open up a new style of deliberate torpedo usage that felt more like Star Trek. For our first Maelstrom, we aimed high, seeking to learn just how long players were willing to defer gratification, a full 90 seconds for the Maelstrom Quantum Torpedo. By and large, these efforts succeeded. We knew these torps would have an outsized impact on PvP and require careful tuning there, but the bigger issue was the torpedoes boss splatting in public queues. While powerful ships melting bosses is not a new issue, the one-shotting things makes it much worse. These issues made it harder for other players to enjoy the game. The torpedo starts charged, so it excelled in organized play designed to complete TFOs extremely quickly, but we saw this as a harmless upside. Lastly, the decision of when to fire the Maelstrom has been mostly about target availability and internal cooldowns, making the high moments a bit samey, not bad, could be better. We set out to build a change list that would target the boss in case and nudge PvP tuning in a healthier direction. We had two main options here. First, a very simple change to recharge time with a broader impact, and second, a more complex change that added mechanics to the weapon, but was more precisely targeted. We made the simple change since we believe the torpedo simply didn't need to store so much power to do its job. The results were spicy. First, players enjoyed the longer charge paradigm more than the faster one unto itself, irrespective of damage. That was a huge surprise, and hints that this torpedo, far from being at the upper extreme of recharge time, might be closer to the sweet spot for it. Second, the torpedo's performance suffered unacceptably in common cases, in particular torpedo builds. The way torpedo builds juggle the global cooldown and select specific torpedoes for specific jobs is far too perfect for the Maelstrom. If the Maelstrom isn't viable there, it's lost its essence. That brings us to the current change list, which will be shipping live soonish. And Kale notes, seriously, no ETA, just sometime soon. We're still playing with it internally, but what we have now restores the damage of the Maelstrom against targets conditionally. Against cruisers and smaller, it always deals its old damage. Against battleships, it's when the shield facing is at or near zero that it will deal its original damage. Against bosses and other players, it's when they're below half of their whole capacity. Recharge time is now a bit faster than 90 seconds since the torp should get some power back for its old damage becoming conditional. The idea here is to try to narrow the impact of the changes while emphasizing healthier gameplay patterns generally. The Maelstrom's premise makes it a natural fit for torpedo and mixed armament builds. We needed to stop it one-shotting bosses, but we also insist it be good in its role. That strategy applies to more than just the Maelstrom. When a fix to a problem harms the core viability of a power, we intend to use these kinds of follow-up changes. The Maelstrom is currently getting that treatment, but it wasn't the first to apply the new plan. Buffs to a couple of other familiar powers will have made their way live by the time of this posting, with the Maelstrom changes following in a subsequent patch. Joel and True. And that was written by Jonathan Herlatch. Now let's go into the breakdown of what exactly this all means. So, what all does this mean for the Maelstrom Quantum Torpedo? The first thing is a disclaimer that they are still tuning some of this stuff internally, so some of the final results may change versus what they discussed in this blog. But the reality is that there are going to be some changes released sometime soon. Could be this Thursday, could be the Thursday at the end of August for all we know. But there's going to be some changes coming soon that are going to bring Maelstrom back up to a point much closer to what it originally was. It's not returning exactly back to how it was, but it's much closer to that than it is to the nerf state that we have right now. So the changes that they're making to the Maelstrom are conditional damage, and they're tuning the recharge time a little bit more. The conditional damage is going to allow the Maelstrom to do its original damage under certain conditions. If you are going against a cruiser or a smaller ship, it is always going to deal that original damage. If you are going against a battleship, it will only do the original damage when the target's shield facing is at or near 0. And against bosses or players in PvP, it will only deal the original damage when the target is below 50% hull capacity. And the reason that these changes are happening is they want to bring Maelstrom back up to a point much closer to how it originally was, but at the same time, they don't want to have the same issues with it potentially one-shotting bosses or players or things like that. They want to make sure that you are using it strategically and that you are using it at an optimal time against your target. So they want you to think when you use it. They don't want you to spam bar it. They want you to wait until your target is vulnerable and then use it. That is, the intention of this weapon. Those of you that can be patient and not spam bar it, and that can wait for your foe to fall into one of those conditions, will net basically the same results as what you originally saw with the Maelstrom, and maybe even better, because the recharge time is going to also be slightly reduced versus the original recharge time. They don't have the exact numbers yet. That is probably what they're still tuning internally, but it's going to be somewhere between where it is right now in the nerf state and what it originally was. So it's not going to take you 90 seconds to get all 3 charges. If I had to guess, I'd probably say 75 to 80 seconds to get 3 charges. That wouldn't be, too much of an improvement, but that would still be a slight improvement. So overall, I think for general use, I think many of you are going to be putting the Maelstrom back on your builds if you had removed it when the nerf went live. I think the Maelstrom is still going to be highly recommended once the changes go live here. And for record chasing, it's going to depend on how you use the Maelstrom. If you were using it to get a really large spike at the start of an ISC, it might not be as good. But if you're using it at other points of the run, then you're still going to be able to benefit from it doing a lot of damage. So overall, really good changes for the Maelstrom, and it is going to be performing much closer to its original state versus the nerfed state that it is currently experiencing. So outside of the Maelstrom itself, there were a couple of other things that I took away from this blog. Number one is communication. The fact that this blog even happened is a huge improvement in contrast to how things were handled a year ago with like the Agony Redistributor, the Web Spinner, and the Neutronic Eddies. This is a huge improvement versus how things were handled last year. The second thing here is that Jonathan clearly is going out of his way to understand how things are being used by players, and most importantly, he is seeking feedback and actually listening to that feedback. When we were trying to give feedback on the Agony Redistributor or the Web Spinner last year, it felt like we were just talking to a brick wall. So I appreciate Jonathan being more receptive to feedback. That is going to, be very helpful for any issues like this long term. Number 3, changes take time, and the changes detailed in this blog will be coming soon. There's no specific date, but it's just good to know that they are being worked on and that they are going to arrive at some point. Number 4, the strategy of this approach will be used for other powers moving forward to retain the core viability of those powers. So when they go through and do balance tuning on things moving forward, they want to make sure that those things are still good at what they were designed for. And that was seen also recently with the recent changes to the Agony redistributor and the web spinner. And the other thing I have here is just some quick notes for anyone at Cryptic watching. When you're going through and doing a balance pass or of an item, nerfing its performance, whatever, it is good to have a detailed explanation in the patch notes to help people understand why something is happening. I know that the Maelstrom blog did eventually have that. The initial version of it, not having any information in there, did cause a bit of frustration. But the other thing that I would mention with regards to patch notes, something that will massively help, calm people down, is stating that things are still subject to change based on feedback, and then linking to a thread on the forums for feedback. If people know that this is not the final version, then that will hopefully calm them down, because the issue again is that there's such a trust issue between the players and the devs that most people, when they see something in the patch notes, if they see something get hit, they think that's it. They don't think that there's any hope of it being changed back. So just having that little bit of information there and like a link to a thread on the forums, that can go a long way towards getting people to chill out a bit and perhaps prevent them from going on a bit of a rant and all that elsewhere. So just something I would consider if you have to do any changes like this moving forward. To summarize everything up here, this is a huge step up communication-wise in comparison to how these things have been handled in the past. If you look back at the Agony redistributor or the Tholian web spinner from last year, the way those were handled was not great. And with Jonathan handling this stuff right now, it is a huge improvement. So huge thanks to Jonathan for going out of his way to understand how we were using these things and taking feedback and listening to that feedback to bring the Maelstrom back to a point that is going to be usable for those of us that were trying to use it for its intended strategic functionality. Now, the changes to Maelstrom, for those of you that have skipped over to the summary here, Maelstrom is going to be much closer to its original state than the nerf state it's currently in. And the way that they're going to be dealing with the issues with it, like one-shotting bosses, is that it will only do its original level of damage when certain conditions are met. Against cruisers and smaller ships, it's always going to do the original damage. Against battleships, it will do the original damage when their shield facings are at or near 0. And against bosses or other players, it will only do the original damage when they are below 50% hull capacity. So if you're using this strategically, you're going to still have a lot of success with this weapon. I think many of you are going to be putting it back on your builds if you had taken it off. And to make it even better, the recharge time on it is going to be a little bit faster than 90 seconds to compensate for its conditional damage there. So it's looking like for many of us, this is going to go back to being as good as it basically was initially. There's going to be some use cases where you may not be getting as much out of it, like if you're just trying to use it at the start of an ISC. But I think for most users, you're going to be satisfied with the changes that they're making. Again, huge thanks to Jonathan and the team for going out and listening to the feedback here and tuning this and not just leaving it as is. It's nice to see that there's an interest there to make sure that these things we've purchased are going to remain usable for the ways that we wanted to use them. And once again, I'd like to say thanks to all channel members and viewers for the continued support. More content coming soon. See you guys around.